This is microphone, yeah, please. Yeah, please speak close to it, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I have sit, I hope. And our first speaker comes from Vilnius University, and he will speak about lexicography this time. And I hope, Liva, we have 20 minutes for, yeah. And I hope we have time for questions, at least for one question for all speakers. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Labrīt. Is the sound good? No? Is it good?
Here.
Can you hear me? Is the sound good? Fine.
No.
So what to do?
Okay.
You have to speak really loud, and you have to go.
So perhaps some people could move closer, because I will have to speak without a microphone. All right, then.
This microphone is for broadcasting, it's not for this room. Yeah,
I see.
speak louder.
So I will. Cienītie Colloquium Balticum dalībnieki, liels gods un prieks man un manajiem kolēģiem no Viļņas Universitātes atkal tikties ar jums šeit, senajā Rīgas pilsētā, jaunajā Latvijas Nacionālās bibliotēkas ēkā, kuras diženums un mūsdienīgas arhitektūras skaistums mums ir radījis milzīgu iespaidu. Atļaujiet man pastāstīt par latīņu leksikogrāfijas iesācējiem Baltijas valstīs, par Juri Elgeru no Latvijas un Konstantīnu Sirvidu no Lietuvas. Mūsdienas lomu, kas Sirvida un Elgera laikmetos ir bijusi latīņu valodai, tagad ir pārņēmusi angļu valodā. Atļaujiet izmantot to manajā priekšlasījumā. 3 years ago, in the then Colloquium Balticum, which was in Vilnius, I was talking about our Latin dictionary database, Thesaurus Latino-Lituanicus. It contains also one of the earliest Latin-Lithuanian dictionaries, not the very earliest, but one of the earliest, written by the founding father of Lithuanian lexicography, Konstantinas Sirvidas. You can see his picture here. It is in our digital philology department office. We borrowed the painting from the National Museum of Lithuania. It's a joke, of course. The painting is still in the museum, and this is a digital copy printed on plastic. And here you see the title page of Sirvidas' dictionary, Dictionarium Trium Linguarum, Polish, Latin, Lithuanian dictionary. Then it came to my attention that about the same time, there was also a very similar dictionary by a Latvian author called Juris Elgers. Unfortunately, I could not find a picture of his. This is the title page. It is a Polish Latin-Latvian dictionary, Dictionarium Polono-Latino-Latavicum. And it is important to know how this dictionary was written. Elgers took Sirvidas' dictionary. He used the Polish and the Latin words, and he substituted the Lithuanian words with their Latvian equivalents. This is important to note in order to follow what I am going to tell later. The dictionary was published in Vilnius, and there is an extant copy in the university library, in the library of the University of Vilnius, about 100 meters from our office. So one day I went there and had a look at it. I'm going to tell you what I found there. First of all, what I was searching for there in the dictionary of Elgers. All dictionaries contain errors. Sirvidas is not exception either. Those errors mostly are typesetter's errors, not the author's errors. Authors themselves are usually competent people, but sometimes even a trivial typesetter's error might render the text incomprehensible. So, when I was indexing the Latin words of the Sirvidas dictionary, I had to make it sure that all words and their meanings and their spellings and everything do match. And there were some puzzling errors. So I thought, if those errors strike me as errors, certainly they would have stricken Elgers 400 years ago as errors, and he must have corrected them somehow. And it was interesting to see how. So let's move on. Let's inspect a simple example. This is an entry from the dictionary of Sirvidas. The Polish word says gersh, and it is a plant. It's called horse parsley. In case you don't know what horse parsley is, it's here, Hipposalinum, horse parsley. A rare plant, by the way. It took me some time to find out its Lithuanian name. For the Lithuanian colleagues, I might tell. In Lithuanian, it's arklių petražolė, but not simply petražolė, but arklių petražolė, horse parsley. Haven't heard this before. So this is the meaning of the Polish word. The Latin version, olus atrum, hipposalinum, that's correct, except for the spelling, hipposalinum, as you can see. But the Lithuanian version says, as you can see, viralas daržinių žolių, which means concoction of garden herbs, as if a vegetable soup or something like that, which is apparently incorrect. What did Elgers do? Let us inspect the corresponding entry in Elgers. Daržo žolė. A garden herb, slightly vague, but nevertheless more correct than Sirvidas's version. It's a vegetable, not a vegetable soup. A Latvian friend told me that the original spelling looks strange from the modern Latvian point of view, but the modern Latvian equivalent is daržo žolė, as I was told. Let's move on. Another example, slightly strange at first sight. The Polish word wspak says backwards. It's an adverb, which means backwards. And the Lithuanian word at the end of the article, you can see it, atžagariai, also means backwards. The Latin says retro ordinem. Retro is okay. Retro means backwards. Why ordinem? It sounds like a Latin construction, retro ordinem, but it might pass for a real construction, but there is no such construction. You would not find it in Latin authors, neither ancient nor modern. What did Elgers do? He removed the word ordinem, retro, and that's it, which is correct. Then I was thinking, how could this word ordinem get into the Sirvidas entry at all? And at this time, it is time to admit that Sirvidas was not original either. He used another dictionary as a basis of his, which is a big and very well-written, enviably well-written, very competent and very big dictionary by Gregorius Knapius, or in modern Polish, Grzegorz Knapski, Polish Latin Greek dictionary, Thesaurus Polono Latino Graecus. Sirvidas took the Polish words from there and many of the Latin words from there and wrote his own Lithuanian words. So if we inspect the corresponding article in Knapius, we can see retro agere ordinem from Quintilian, which is correct. Retro agere ordinem, to reverse the order of things. It is obvious that the typesetter of Sirvidas's dictionary accidentally omitted the word agere, and what came out was a puzzling nonsense. Let's inspect another example. Zakończenie in Polish means finishing, but also sharpening. And the Lithuanian word ažusmailinimas means sharpening. What is Latin? Execution? Do you have an idea what it could be? Now, let's look up the correct answer in Knapius. Executio, sharpening. A simple typesetter's error. But at this time I have to say, Elgers did not have a copy of Knapius. He did not use it. How do I know that? I will demonstrate to you slightly later. But it is for sure, 100% sure, that Elgers had only Sirvidas's dictionary, no Knapius, and he had to correct Sirvidas's dictionary using only his own competence. What did he do? What do we see in Elgers? Executio. He understood the matter, but bloody typesetter gobbled his word. Another example, very clearly the work of a typesetter. The Polish word zatwardziałość says rigidity, as if it were duritia or something like that in Latin, rigidity. And the Latin says duratus, which is rigid, not rigidity. And the Lithuanian, ažukietėjis, in 17th century Aukštaitian dialect, also says rigid. Looks like a haplography. It looks like the start of the article is from one article, and the end of this article comes from the subsequent article, the middle being omitted. Haplography, it's called. If we inspect Knapius, we can see this is exactly the matter. The entries for rigidity and rigid go one after another. Sirvidas himself could not make such silly mistake because he was a competent man. How do I know that? Because from the entirety of his dictionary, there are 15,000 articles and all are correct. Only a few errors like I'm showing you. You don't have to have an impression that it is full of errors. 15,000 articles are correct. Those few are wrong. So, what did Elgers do? He did not have a copy of Knapius. He only had to use his own competence. He rewrote the article completely. He left the Polish word, zatwardziałość, which means rigidity, but it can also mean stubbornness, obstination. And so he put obstinatio in Latin and translated it into Latvian. Cietsirdība. But there was one article which was too difficult even for Elgers. Oops. Before that, I should have said that this is the proof that Elgers did not use Knapius's dictionary. He corrected his errors based on his own competence. We can see that. But there was one article. Let us have a look. The Polish word says przedzielnica. Does anyone know what it means? Are there any Polish people there? No. I could not find this word in Polish Lithuanian dictionaries which were available to me. I'm sure that it is in some dictionaries which were not available to me, but in those which were available, I could not find it. The Lithuanian word says perskirklė. There are many Lithuanian people in this room. Who of you knows what is perskirklė? Do you know that? But if you do, please don't tell yet. And now let's look at the Latin. Accus criminalis. Accus is a needle, right? What? A criminal needle? Do you have an idea what it could be? When I was working on this article, I did not have a copy of Knapius yet. I found it later. But at that time, I didn't have it. And it took me quite a while of thinking what it could be. There are some superfluous letters. If we delete 2 letters, from the word criminalis. What do we get? Acus crinalis, a hairpin, an innocent item. What did Elgers do? Did he solve the riddle? We can find the alphabetic place in his dictionary and to see what he has done. Let us have a look. What will we see? Quite disappointing. He couldn't make anything of it. He omitted the troublesome article altogether. Criminal needles, something like that. Better to stay away from these things. And finally, when I got a copy of Knapius, I looked it up, and of course, acus crinalis, a hairpin. This also proves that Elgers did not use Knapius's dictionary, only Sirvidus's. And this is our scholarly conclusion. I have read in some serious literature saying that Elgers used both Sirvidus and Knapius. No, he did not see Knapius, we can see that. Scholarly conclusion. But what practical conclusions? What do we have actually? We have the same dictionary, the same set of words, Latin and Polish words, translated by two people into their respective languages, into Lithuanian by Sirvidus and into Latvian by Elgers. What we actually have here is a 17th century Latvian-Lithuanian dictionary. Can you imagine such a thing? When first Latvian-Lithuanian or Lithuanian-Latvian dictionary appeared, it's hard for me to say, but I think it must have been no earlier than the 19th century. No, we have much earlier one, a virtual one, 17th century one, via Latin and Polish. What can we do? I appeal to my Latvian colleagues, and Liva first of all. Yes, Liva, I'm talking to you now. Please wave your hand. This is Liva. You can type this dictionary by Elgers. We have the facsimiles, and we have the technology. We can put it into the database, and so we could have this thing. Now it is Thesaurus Latino-Lituanicus. It can become Thesaurus Balticus. And probably other European nations later would join us subsequently our initiative, so that with time we would have a universal, pan-European Latin dictionary. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and it's a pity that there are no Estonian, Latvian, and Latin dictionary we can add to your project.
I don't know that. We should ask Estonian colleagues. I'm not sure about that.
I can say.
You can say that? I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Question, one question.
No questions.
No. Yeah. Oh, there are.
Yes. Yes, Roman.
In this article about, can I speak from here?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't.
You have to stand here. You can stand here and no. It's okay, you don't have to do it.
Can I speak?
Yes.
So,
Go on. Go ahead.
this execution article, did I understand right, I'm not sure, that in two different dictionaries, there are
Both wrong.
both wrong, the same error in the same, not the same error, but they both did an error in the same words.
That's right.
A little, I don't know, shocking or
I hope that it is coincidental. There is a different sort of errors, but it happens.
Because when you work on an article with an error, you you actually spend so much time to think and rethink what
Yes.
the error might be, and then with a lot of diligence you correct it. And
Indeed.
it's striking that it is not like that.
Execution. I think I have an explanation. Obviously, it was a typesetter's error. Why did not Elgers correct this error in the proof copy? Because he was dead at that time. It was a posthumous edition. Indeed so. Yeah, it's serious.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I hope we have changed now. And we will go on. Our next speaker is Mara Kudula. He is from Latvia, from Riga, and she will speak today about something something interesting about early Latvian poetry.
So, thank you for introducing me, and I would like also to thank the organizers of the conference. That's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak about the classical literature and also Latvian literature. So I'm going to speak on suffix stanza in the 17th century Latvian literature. Oops. The suffix stanza was named after a Greek poet Sappho, who lived in the 6th century before Christ on the island of Lesbos. Lesbos literature is characterized by deliberate avoidance of long stanzas. Lyrics are often written in quatrains, and it is well illustrated by the works of Sappho, as well as the second most lauded poet of Lesbos, Alcaeus. The literature of Lesbos is different also in terms of style, as its short form requires concentration and specific, relatively limited subjective selection of language means. Sappho today is mostly associated with homosexual revelations in poetry. She was a governess to noble girls, and thus her wedding and love poetry might have been created as a teaching tool for sex life in marriage. Sappho's poetry contemplates a youthful female beauty and love. It is very personal and prone to metaphysical generalizations. She is regarded as a discoverer of female psychology and aesthetics of Eros. Vase paintings often depict Sappho with barbitos, or barmas as it is called, on the island of Lesbos. This instrument, played for entertainment during parties, was typically made of turtle shells that created a lower and softer sound than traditional lyre. The suffix stanza pervades poetry from its beginning to the present day. While the fascination with homoerotic themes in Sappho's poetry drifted out of focus in medieval and Renaissance literature, the interest resurfaced and stirred European poets only at the second half of the 19th century, mainly due to Baudelaire and his contemporaries. My today's presentation will not focus on the reception of the content and subject matter of Sappho's poetry. I would rather dwell on the use of suffix stanza in the 17th century Latvian hymns. First of all, what is suffix stanza? It consists of 4 lines. Each of the first 3 has a trochee, spondee, dactyl, and at the end 2 trochees again. The last syllable may be long or short. There is a caesura after the 5th syllable. The 4th line is adonic and consists of a dactyl and a spondee. The suffix stanza is used in religious poetry already in the Middle Ages, most likely firstly borrowed from Horatio in the 8th century by Paul the Deacon, a Benedictine of Monte Cassino, in the Latin hymn Ut quent laxes. Further, it is used as in Catholic, so in Protestant hymns. The history of Latvian literature has not extended its theoretical concerns to the suffix stanza. The most comprehensive discussion is offered by Jānis Rudzītis. A brief review of Sappho, her poetry, translation, and reception by Latvian readership is published by Māris Vecvagars. but Sappho's poetic form received its attention in all the poetics and poetry dictionaries on Latvian lyrics published since the 17th century. This metrical form is used later in the works of Juris Alunāns, Rainis, Jānis Medenis, Viktors Eglītis, Elzas Tērste, Jānis Plaudis, Sandris Vējāns, and others. But back to the 17th century. The year 1621 welcomes the first Latvian Catholic hymnal. Its compiler is a Jesuit, Georg Elgar. Perhaps a Latvian. The only extant copy of the hymnal of 1621 was found in the Scientific Library of the University of Vilnius, only in the 70s of the 20th century. The texts were studied by linguists, but hardly by literary scholars. The book represents the initial stage of Jesuit activity that might be regarded as the Reformation and new path searching within the Catholic Church. The Jesuits set a primary task of raising a free personality by means of catechization and comprehensive education for the young generation. By and large, they do not oppose the popular pagan manifestations, but try to tolerate and diplomatically integrate them into the Catholic world. Moreover, religious texts tend to incorporate the folk language with its conversational style and idiomatic expressions, as well as cultural and social realia. Elgar's hymnal shares the above-mentioned qualities. A bigger share are translations from German and Latin, relatively less from the Polish language, whereas the identity of 15 songs has not been established yet. Since the latter part of the texts is in a rather decent Latvian, elegant and rhythmical, they could be either Elgar's compositions or the texts familiar in Latvian Catholic environment and sung already in pre-Reformation period. Elgar is known to be the first to use rhyme and consider national accent in Latvian poetry. His hymnal, already at the beginning of the 17th century, impresses by being articulate and relatively fluent in terms of metrical form. Perhaps this very aspect is associated with Elgar's nationality. However, the written Latvian in Elgar's hymnal is quite poor, brimming with numerous mistakes, which is not in fact surprising because it is only the second book ever created by Catholics for Latvians, and there is no direct evidence that Elgar was interested in or used the Riga Protestant written tradition at that time. Elgar's hymnal meets the principles of the Catholic hymnals. The book concludes with litany and texts for different purposes, including Catholic catechization and quite unique viena dziesma no tām 4 pēdīgām lietām – raudat, kam nemīl vairāk kā līgsmot. One song about the 4 last things, those who love not shall cry more than rejoice, contemplates a motive of death, last judgment, heaven and hell, which is much exploited in Renaissance literature. The mentioning of Dante's Divine Comedy or Hieronymus Bosch painting The 7 Deadly Sins would suffice to illustrate the above mentioned. At the beginning of the 17th century, the motive of death and destruction is quite represented because of war, famine, and plague. This rhythmic and formal arrangement in poetry, the Sapphic stanza, Alexandrines, Odes of Pindar, Etiostic, and Acrostic, might have been a response to an overwhelming instability and house. Georg Elgar contemplates the 4 last things in 49 Sapphic stanzas. This song has not been so far aligned with German, Latin, or Latin texts, and by its content it might have been penned by Elgar himself. He did not cling closely to the metrical form, but I would hardly be mistaken to claim that each first 3 lines of every verse that consisted of 4 stanzas tended to be 11 syllables long, whereas the 4th line 5 syllables long. This form is conspicuously displayed, hence it is surprising that so far no one has considered that. The Sapphic stanza was used in Latin sacred hymns. However, there is no evidence that it was used also in German Catholic hymns, and thus Elgar may be one of the first to use it in the sacred texts composed in the language of commoners. Content-wise, we may follow the trail of themes of death, the last judgment, and hell and heaven. However, almost each stanza might be perceived as a separate unit. Elgar's Catholic hymnal experienced the second edition after Elgar's death in 1673, but rather interestingly, the previous arrangement of verses for this hymn is dismantled and some of the stanzas are included into three different cycles: De Morte, about death; De Judica, about the Last Judgment; De Inferno, about hell. At the second half of the 17th century, the Catholic Church stabilized its position and plunged into conservatism. Elgar's vivid expression was edited and the most expressive elements of Latvian daily life were left out. A few examples. It kā zivs to tār par makšķer aprī, nedz kā apakšbarība tā nāvi paslēpt, bet iekšen acu mirkli to nāvīgi kārum dārgi atmaksā. A fish swallows the worm from the hook of a fishing line. It does not see that the food hides its death, but for this delicacy inside it pays a high price. It is ignorant of danger, cares only to eat, to drink, to have fun, with shameless words and deeds, thus deserving hell. But what human lives and does not die, even if young, strong, beautiful, rich and educated, men and women, lads and maidens, everyone shall die. Neither gold nor silver will help there. Silver brooch, ring on the finger, golden hair, rosy cheek will not deliver you from death. However, the suffix stanza is used also in the German Lutheran hymns and their translations. All German hymn writers kept 11 syllables in the first 3 lines and Adonis in the 4th, but neither the metrical pattern of caesura nor the first 3 verses show consistency, which probably might be explained, as already claimed by Jānis Rudzītis, by the fact, I quote, that in the Middle Ages the vulgarized suffix stanza was set not against quantitative metrical principles, but tonic, subject only to the Latin grammatical accents. Martin Opitz presumed that former metrical patterns in the 17th century transformed into syllabatonic forms activated by a set of long syllable, strong syllable, and short syllable, weak syllable relations. The suffix stanza thus has already lost its connection with the original form. Instead of a trochee, often resorts to a iambus, sometimes approximating a trochee only for the first verses of hymns. A iambus is also the most popular meter for the spiritual songs, and it is well supported by the examples from Fireker's Latvian hymns. It is therefore not surprising that in the Baltics, at the end of the 17th century, a pastor of Dundaga, Johann Wischmann, when discussing the possibility of the suffix stanza in Latvian poetry, points out that its metrical form differs from the form in Latin poetry. In most cases, it is iambic. At the end of the 17th century and at the beginning of the 18th century, this iambic suffix stanza is used in 4 hymns written and translated into Latvian from German by Christopher Fireker, 1 by Ernst Glick, 1 by Bernhard Wilhelm Bienemann, and 2 quatrains by Johann Wischmann. They all are iambic in the initial terza. The concluding verse consistently keeps Adonis, dactyl, and trochaic feet. Christopher Fireker is the first to use the suffix stanza in Latvian Lutheran hymns, and he is not only the most skilled user in this metrical pattern for his times, but also an expert in the subtleties of the Latvian language. The mastery of Fireker shines particularly bright in the translation of Johann Hermann's Herzliebster Jesu, O Dearest Jesus. As it is generally characteristic of the translation of poetry, Fireker retains the original idea and form, but treats the expression within the stanzas freely. He writes directly to Latvians and uses in his translation the characteristics of the Latvian language, as well as Latvian traits and habits. Some excerpts to illustrate. Reduplication or close repetition of the same root or stem, widely used in Latvian folk song, adds to musicality. You will be hostage and crowned with thorns, slapped in the face and ridiculed. You will be given vinegar and gall to drink, hung on the cross. Tu tapsi sašausts un kā sūcina sūkāts, ar iekšķiem badīts un kā plūcina plūkāts, ar etiķīm un rūkstām žultīm dzirdīts, kā nekā tirdīts. You will be shot and sucking sucked, with thorns gaunt and plucking plucked, given vinegar and bitter gall to drink tormented. The allegory of human and nature makes it easier for peasants to understand the content. For example, I was brimming with dishonor and sins from the very bottom of my feet to the very top of my head there, not anything good in me. Therefore, I was doomed to hell, eternal repentance. Where could I have been a green and solid tree? There I was full of sin from the bottom of my feet, for that my bones will eternally burn on the rotten wood of hell. And finally, thirdly, Fireker accommodates Hermann's worldly pleasures by aligning those with singing and dancing, also typical for Latvians. Oh, great love, that is Johann Hermann, oh, unconditioned love that took you to the path of martyr. I live in the joy and hust of this world, and you have to suffer. And Fireker, I went singing and dancing but Jesus Christ carries it falling to the ground. Look, what all-consuming love comes into being. He goes to death. And Ernst Gluck is better known to Latvians as a translator of the Bible, but he also penned 4 Latvian hymns. One of them, the hymn Klaus mana dvēsele kāda grūta vaida, Listen, my soul, what a moan, is a brief translation of Vincent Schmuck's text, based in John's Gospel and contemplating Christ's 7 words on the cross. But Schmuck's hymn is of a different form, a iambic quint. Glick himself transforms it into the suffix stanza, keeping all 9 of Schmuck's iambic verses, directing to the 5th into the suffix stanza, and for the sake of visibility, also bolding the excerpts of Bible texts. Good and sonorous is also Zemīte Pastor Bernhard Bienemann translation of Ringwald's Lobet der Herr, Praise the Lord. And finally, Wishman's suffix stanza. As I mentioned earlier, he is the first to accentuate the possibility of the suffix stanza in Latvian poetry in his Der Undeutsche Opitz, and he is the only one to pay attention not only to 11-syllable pattern and Adonis, but to emphasize the initial idea of suffix stanza, that is, its laconism and consciousness. Wishman complements short theoretical description by 2 examples. Both his suffix stanzas are poignant epigrams. Moreover, those are the only examples of that time that are written in Latvian and devoid of religious content. It is this common human and philosophical content of poetry that is underestimated even today in the first Latvian poetics. To illustrate the point, both Wishman's suffix stanzas are offered below. Neesi draugs uz manām domām čaklis, in paša darbos vairs kā kurmis aklis, kas man ar skauģa acīm grib zudušus sprāks vidū pušu. Do not mind, my friend, go after my thoughts and be blind as a mole in your own tasks. The one who envies me and wants my ruin shall die himself. Tas godīgs draugs, kas nepriekš acīm slavē, kas šķīstu muti tur, kas ņem par labu, man raudot raud, man gavējot līdzgavē, sveiks, kas to dabū. The trustful friend who praises not to please, who is chaste and pure in his speech and grateful, who weeps when I weep, who fasts when I fast, be safe and sound, the one who gets that. And finally, to sum up, at the end of the 17th century, Latvian Lutheran hymnals already include more than 400 hymns. Almost 100 hymns in reprint are published in the Latvian Catholic hymnal. However, judging by the archives, rural parishes at that time sing only about 6 to 8 hymns, learned with the help of a pastor or a church foresinger. Seldom those are 12. The number of acquired hymns starts growing when the parishioners get their hymnals. Presumably, in Kurland and Livland, it is not earlier than in the 18th century due to a low literacy rate. And it seems that these texts, written and translated in suffix stanzas by Gluck, Vierecker, Bienemann, and Wishman, served the purpose of self-determination and artistic expression, even then in the 17th century, attesting the exclusively artistic function of literature. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for one question. Yeah. Yeah, I think.
It's a really short question. Since I'm not familiar with the history of Latvian accentuation, I just wanted to ask, was the accent of Latvian language the same in the 17th century, or more or less the same as it is now? Was it fixed on the first syllable, or was it slightly different?
Yeah, thank you. It was fixed on the first syllable, and it was regarded by Christopher Vierecker and put down in the grammar of Adolphius at the end of the 17th century.
Thank you. We've changed. Yeah. If there are other questions, we can. Yeah, Mark.
Just
Yeah,
shortly,
yeah.
You said the caesura changed, and I think the caesura of the suffix trophy isn't sapphic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's Horatius, and it might be that in 1554 you could read texts in Greek of Sappho with another without caesura.
Yeah, of course, you are right. I didn't have time to tell the history. You are right, but there are few songs, the German examples, where you can find caesura.
Yeah.
That's also very interesting to look the sources they used, the German authors, not only the...
Which was hard.
Yeah, it was, you are right, yeah.
But you could use Sappho from the
originals,
16th century.
yeah. Thank you.
And I would like to introduce now my colleague from Tartu. She's now Annika Kuuse. She's now a doctoral student in Helsinki University.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear back? Thanks you. The present study examines Latin occasional poems which were written and printed in Turku, Finland, in the second half of the 17th century. Assuming poets spoke Latin not as a mother's tongue, how might they have written in classical Latin, which requires a subtle understanding of syllable length? If the scansion shows that they understood the verse as a native speaker would have, it may show that vowel length of Neo-Latin, New Latin, had not been overtaken by stress or by influence of the second language. There are alternatives, however, that authors were well educated, who memorized and meticulously applied their knowledge of the various forms. The poems were many times re-corrected or proofread, or that writers were indeed influenced by their own language or lack of knowledge, and the text contains deviation from classical phonology. Thus, the individual has intuitive knowledge of Latin language. Is he or she, able to produce fluent, spontaneous discourse and create quantitative meters like ancient hexameter. After the Academy of Turgu had been founded in 1940, a large number of collection of Latin occasional poems were produced in Finland by native Swedes, Finns, and Germans. I hope to throw some light upon the syllabic and accentual structure of Neo-Latin hexameter of occasional poetry of Turgu. The material present research consists of small prints of Latin congratulatory poems in hexameters written for dissertations. My main sources have been the publications of Neo-Latin poems available in open database of digitized dissertation of the National Library of Finland. And I have used in the process of my research the following bibliographies. The material comprises 700 hexameters by authors from Turgu. In this investigation, the aim is not to give idiosyncratic rhythm of all poets, but to try to assess or describe the structure of hexameter of the time period. These particular poets are chosen because they were from different field and with different amount of experience. And statistical analysis combined with comparative analysis, if needed, is the method. It contains data on the accentual and quantitative structures as well as of the word boundaries. Thus, I examined the scansions and accentuations while only mentioning the syntax when it's needed to indicate weaker or stronger word boundaries. Now let's turn to verses. In hexameter, the long first position will be followed by either longer spondee or two short syllables, as you all know. Thus, first positions are always filled with long syllables, and the second ones are realized with one long or two short syllables. One of the main factors which determine the variety in hexameter, it is a contraction. My analysis has showed that the hexameters of the 17th century have a large proportion of contractions in the fourth foot, 67%, in the third, 65%, and in the second foot. There are almost no contractions in the fifth foot, while in the fourth foot the occurrences of the replacements is the highest. In Tartu, have a look, figure 2. In Tartu, in the fourth foot is 68%, in the third 66%, in the second 57%, and in the first 38%. The rhythm is based on continual rise of spondaic feet until the fourth foot. The lowest occurrences of contractions are in the first foot, and the highest occurrences of contractions are in the fourth foot. It seems safe to conclude that hexameters of different universities follow the same pattern of verse. You can see blue is Tartu and red is Turgu. In the Homeric dactylic hexameter, only one verse in 50 ends with two spondees. Therefore, the fifth foot was usually a dactyl, as it is typical to the classical hexameter in general. This metrical possibility with spondee in the fifth foot is rare in Latin hexameter. In this study, we have 3 examples where the fifth foot is spondaic. One by Oman, Oman. One by Solomon Einerberg, and the last one by Andreas Ulstadius. Among the verses, only a small group of hexameters with purely dactylic structure can be distinguished. Let's have a look at these examples also. For example, Miltopaus and Styrenius. Sorry, you most likely can't see the framework of last verse. It has changed here, but it's all dactyls in the middle of the verse. So the last example presents also a case of using alliteration. In the next stage of analysis, I have studied verse lines as a whole. I'd like us to look at slide here. Here we can see the most regular type of hexameter, and it is with contractions in the second, third, and fourth foot. There are as well very small groups, less than 4% of verses, which include contractions only in the first or in the second foot. It must be remembered that poets relied on the example of both the classics and the Christian poets. During the analysis, some common prosodic features and also aberrations or deviations were found. Let's see, do I have? Yes, I have here. The shortening of long final vowels in words not subject to the brevis previans law was commonly applied to the final O of first-person verb forms. For example, here, mitto, this red O, or tolpos skio. Most likely, the quantity of vowels remained not the single, but most likely it remained a problematic element of Neo-Latin verse composition. A word initial S group, beginning with S plosive, ST, ST, SC, ST, don't create a position. For example, here is, do I have? Yes, example number 3. And in Latin poetry also normally S group doesn't lengthen the previous syllable. Example number 4, is often used in front of vowels and treated as long. Should be short. Could it be because of stress? Maybe. Lexical features that fix the prosodic problems were, for example, ast for at. The results obtained from the analysis of syllabics of hexameter are presented in figure 4. Let's see. Yes, figure 4. And the number of contractions depends directly of number of syllables in a line. It appears that the actual number of syllables in line is limited to 13 to 17 syllables. The number of syllables corresponds to metrical elements. The incidence verse lines with different syllables count shows that 15 syllable verse are predominant. Even in the quantitative syllabic verse system is the most relevant distribution of quantities and number of syllables. The second part of this paper examines the significance of placement of stress. Figure 5, let's see, presents an overview of different stress types on the first position of verse feet. As can be seen, the greatest occurrences of primary stress in the first, 75%, in the fifth, 95%, and in the sixth foot, 99%. The lowest degree of occurrences is in the third foot, 10%. And then follows the second foot and the fourth foot with 45%. And figure 6 present proportion of stress types. Stress types on the second position of contracted foot. Comparing the relationship between primary stress and long syllables, we see that accentual and quantitative structure in the first position of feet is not always correlated. Stress pattern in the beginning of the fifth, sixth, and first foot is very similar to ancient one. Strong positions are always filled with stressed syllables in two last feet. Verses are arranged such that long syllables don't avoid the natural stress of word in the first, fifth, and sixth foot. In the middle of hexameter, first long syllable of the feet and stress were expected to be in opposition. Word boundaries. Let's go on with word boundaries. Word boundaries are distinguished on three different levels. The word boundaries of the first level, it is weak level, separate different parts of compound words as well as pro and inclitics elision. The word boundaries of the second level separate lexemes with syntagms, and the word boundaries of the third level mark the boundaries of syntagms and phrases. We can see figure 8 that in New Latin hexameter, the main caesura is a masculine caesura in the third foot, which is followed statistically by the masculine caesura in the fourth foot and in the second foot. Word break after the first position longum in the fifth foot was usually avoided. 96% of feet are without word boundaries. Authors were able to think more than one line at a time. Why? I think that there is the continuation of a sentence without a strong word boundary beyond the end of a line, 40%, and strong word end, 14%, supports the explanation of enjambment. Correspondence between metrical boundaries and word boundaries follows classical examples of hexameters. The main caesura is in the third foot after the first syllable in the third foot, masculine caesura, and the second foot caesura with pairs with one in the fourth foot. Feminine caesura is very rare. Word ends occur inside the feet and don't coincide with metrical boundaries, except the first foot where we saw higher proportion of strong word boundaries. The most important similarities with ancient hexameters are constant high proportion and distribution of contraction. From the viewpoint of classical standards, these findings show that the hexameter structure of New Latin, in spite of certain differences, is for the most part not different from the syllabic structure of the ancient authors, ancient hexameter. After comparing all poets with Virgil, green line here, and with ancient Roman poets, Ennius, Cicero, Catullus, Lucretius, Vergilius, I read in Latin, Horatius, Juvenalis, Lucanus, Ovidius, and so on, we can conclude that almost all poets follow the classical model of hexameter. The black line here in chart shows the proportion of contracted verse feet of ancient Roman poets. Results of Tartu and Turgu are very similar, although authors in Tartu used slightly more spondees in general. It can be said that authors of New Latin hexameter seems to have quite aware about the structure of the ancient hexameter. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika, and we have time for one quick question. Yeah, Mark.
A small question.
Yeah.
Another question. You say it's the same as in ancient hexameter. I would say in ancient Latin hexameter.
Yes.
Greek is exactly
Yes.
contrary.
Yes, good point, because here I talk only Latin hexameter. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation and the concrete results you presented. As my knowledge about Turku dissertations in the 17th century is very poor, I would like to ask a more general question. Do they only occur, those dedications and dissertations, do they only occur in the 17th century? Do they only occur in certain fields of scholarship? And what's the normal contents? Is it a dedication to whom? So what can we say in general about the context and the dedication itself?
Yes, actually, in material of Turgu, I have dissertation poems from dissertations, and material of Tartu, I have a wider material. So in Turgu, dissertations were written to very extent audience, very extent, let's say audience, yes. And for example, themes of dissertations are from physics to medicine, poetry,
all fields of
very, very wide, yes.
And do we have one short last question in native language, in Finnish language? Do we also have dedications in their own language?
Yes, but I didn't study this. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Also, our last speaker of this session comes from Switzerland, from Fribourg. As he said, his first time in Colloquium Balticum, maybe.
Maybe.
And he has a very promising title on the coolness of elegy. We are very interesting. What will it be? Please.
First, thanks to Vita Paparinska, Liva Podniece. And since I'm speaking on elegy, I would like to think as well of Jan Windt, whose birthday would have been today. And some of the people in this room knew him as a teacher and a friend. So I understand, but you have to be quiet. Well, as a classical scholar in modern university, I'm used to giving courses on subjects such as ancient form in modern literature, but usually when I compare Homer to Mickiewicz or Aeschylus to Schiller, Aristophanes to Beaumarchais, the answer is no. No, there is no continuity. We cannot apply the contemporary narratology of success stories as Greimas or Hollywood would have it, to the inversion forms of Sophocles or of the Odyssey, that is, a form that inverts unhappiness into happiness or happiness into misfortune, according to Aristotle or Hegel. This attitude is not very popular with my students, but I think there is some political truth in it. And when I started to work on elegy, an ancient form, or at least an ancient word that seems to come to life in the 8th century before our era, the handbooks seemed in tune with my mantra. According to the handbook, ancient elegy is first political under the Greeks, then under the Romans erotic, and acquires with Kochanowski, and most of all with Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, a whiny quality that has been followed by the admirers in Germany and Russia and seemed to define the semantic matrix of the word in all modern dictionaries, where elegy, I Wikikno quote, is a mournful, melancholic, or plaintive poem. But when I read the texts and I put them in a line together, it seemed to me that for once there is maybe only coincidentally, but still, a striking continuity between Theognis Elegeia in the Greek 6th century BC and the World War I elegies of Rilke. What continues, I think, is a feeling the Greeks called hesychia, the 18th century Heiterkeit, which has nothing to do with the 20th century Oktoberfest, but was a quality that seemed lost until the 1980 generation gave a new positive meaning to a word of the 1960s. It's this coolness I would like to follow, and I shall start with what's called elegos and what produced elegeia, the singing part of Greek archaic symposia. Theognis probably lived in Megara, near Athens, in the 1770s of the 6th century BC, a time Plutarchus later called a wild or unbridled democracy. Theognis compares this to the situation of Ithaca in the Odyssey, a reign of the young, as in the film The Wild One of 1953, with Marlon Brando starring as the chief of a rocker gang terrorizing good American citizens. Whatever the political structure was in Megara, the oligarchic party had lost some of its power. But still, the adult male aristocrats gathered in the symposium less to console themselves than to chant the songs that contradicted the gatherings or parties which in Megara, as in the Odyssey, or elsewhere in the archaic Greece, seemingly were called iamboi. For ancient Greek literature, or should we say ancient Greek performance, was not defined by genre rules, but by gender rules, rather by the gender of the audience. Married women could shout the ololygmos, or had their symposia where they had wine and heard invited bards sing catalogues. The young girls gathered to dance and choral song. Unmarried young men attended to iamboi, where they heard text not unlike rap without musical instruments. A mixed married audience listened to epic bards, whereas married men, only married men, sung between themselves in symposia to the tune of auloi, mostly in the meter we call elegiac, an hexameter and a pentameter. Symposium was a rite in which the participants showed that they were andres, complete adult married men. Neither had they the right to stay sober and to drink water, nor to get drunk with wine. Unlike women, young men or barbarians, they had to blend wine and water and to reach an intermediary state. This definition of maleness has nothing to do with Dionysus. When in war, they chant the paean, a male text, for both the manslayer, Apollo, and the medical god, Apollo, who keeps them alive. And in one of Pindar's paeans, the word heisuchia, the calmness, keeps recurring. In the symposium, this balance-seeking drinking rite comes with a strange singing rite my friends have begun to call the crocodile. For you possibly did it in your childhood too. There is a group game where the first player has to draw a monster's head on the left side of a paper sheet. Then you hide or not the head and give it to the next player, who shall imagine the breast and the forelegs. When this is done, he gives it to the next for the belly and so on, the result frequently being a funny crocodile. Now, this is what happens in ancient elegy. The beds, the cleanae, are arranged in an order of social importance, A, B, C, D, and this is the order to sing the elegies. But as we can see in Aristophanes' Wasps, there is a form, a syntax as well. The basileus, the maître of ceremonies, imposes the subject. Desire, as Eryximachos in Plato's Symposion, or the seasons, as Alkaios, or drinking, as Theognis, but never war, never iambic themes, as we hear from Xenophanes. The first drinker, the wealthiest, has now the easiest part. He has to find among the elegies he has learned as a boy, or more recently, one that fits the subject. The next one can change a little bit the theme, but there have to be some keywords in common with the elegy. The first singer intonated to the blatant tune of the Iaulos. A rented girl was playing between the cleanae. and so on. Nietzsche, and after him Lentini, could find whole dialogue chains in the first edition of Theognis Elegies. So you have an example. You can see one example of what is called Nietzsche's catchword theory. One series on business is marked in yellow, is followed by a green one on credit, pistos, and so on. When the future philosopher discovered these repetitions, he thought of the Kommissbuch, das Kommissbuch of the German student societies, where, like in a church songbook, the songs are printed in a thematic order and thus contain common catchwords. I have to hurry. What characterizes both this ancient crocodile rite and the text it produces is firstly the joyous lack of control, the unpredictable blending of different voices that seems to echo the blending of different liquids and, in a way, the blending of different rhythms is the experience of the god Dionysus himself, a feeling of giving up a part of oneself that could be paralleled by the mead. The texts we have from this male practice are different from the text of unmarried young men or of the female symposium in that they never show variation between discourses such as narrator speech and character speech. It's all the same speech of different characters. This is why Vernon thought that this rite was the model of Attic theater. The elegy of the symposium essentially does not express joy or anger, but is the quest for a balance, a calmness or coolness that has medical qualities and can be found in the songs, especially in the hymns that came before the crocodile. One example, I have but a German translation: Bete weder ums Top in der Stellung, Kind des Herrn Banker, noch auf dem Konto. Genug für einen Mann ist es Glück. What in the handbook is called the Greek search for the middle way should be understood as an absence of extremes, as the calm we can find as well in Gray, who describes in this epitaph, doesn't work anymore, no? Okay. Okay. Who describes in this epigraph on a fameless dead man the inscription he found in the country churchyard. This double play of an epitaph within the epitaph, strictly spoken, is a Hellenistic epigram. Callimachus' trick to create an impression of imaginary space for the first Greek readers in the modern sense of reader. Fame stays away from this unknown dead because his funeral inscription displays less poetic and sculpting quality than Gray's elegy. The steady caesuras of the afterwards quoted inscription, for instance, contrast with the freer cutting routine of the elegist. But this pretended melancholy did not draw its success from the sentimentalism that was in vogue back then, but from a feeling of detachment from the world that creates a certain negation of the norm. What the elegist can say from this point of view is that there is no reason to laugh at the formal cliches a normal man will find himself buried under, not because they destroy the catalogue's elegance of the long elegy, but rather because mistakes give a break from the social and poetic norm. They help discover a fresh, virginal realm of liberty, a Heiterkeit, or, as I have suggested, coolness that was typical of Baroque rhetoric. A similar transposition of hesychia by a broken normative rhetoric can be found in Rilke's fourth elegy, written, which is important in Italy, in Duino. Here, the beginning. I read it. It's important. O Bäume Lebens, o wann winterlich. Wir sind nicht einig, sind nicht wie die Zugvögel verständigt, überholt und spät. So drängen wir uns plötzlich Winden auf. Like Gray or Theognis, Rilke uses groups of four, but with the colon breaks, Gray's narrator tried to smooth out. What Celan and other poets called caesura, not the traditional cut within a verse, but rather the Hellenistic or Callimachian cutting of syntactic or lexical units at the end of the verse, is exemplified in the first tropy or turn. The Italian toia, or we might think of the xylon zoes of the Apocalypses, or in German Lebensbaum, is cut in two words and inverted into Bäume Lebens. Lebensbäume, Bäume Lebens. This world of figures, of tropes, associated by the German reading tradition since Goethe's Italian journey with the south, the jungle of the tropes, has been inverted. O wann winterlich, O when wintry. In the end of the four lines, the dative blue of the wind, winden, gives the clue for what the winter might represent. Winden is, secondly, the infinitive of the verb winden, to turn, to screw, to wind, and thirdly, the manival helping wind things up. The question, oh, when wintry, asks then when it is time to turn the evergreen Thuja, the tree of life, into inverted Bäume Lebens in a cold, wintry way. The evergreen is too hot. The inversion, the cutting, helps not to be like the Zugvögel, the birds flying into the southern figuras in a geometric formation. Only being late and being overcome can help, like the Callimachian or Celanisch line cutting of Zugvögel. This is the way to impose oneself to winds or windings. The cold wind is a hint at Valéry's fileuse. Au bleu de la croisée où tu filais la laine, in the blue of the crossing where you were spinning the wool, la laine, the wool, rhymes with haleine. The breath. The wind is the breath of the reader. In the cutting, Rilke is looking for a cool space within the text, less hot than in Goethe's Italian tropes. Caesar and Propertius might have put it like this: I don't like the sandwich aesthetics of Cicero or Homer. The concinum or going together of units of repetitions, the tropes winding hot. We need a décalage, a shifting between the units, between the tropes. So we have started with the coolness that could be found in the practice rather than in the texts of ancient Greek symposion, in the balance between the drogues of wine and water, But the songs still reflect some of this male in-between state. Propertius tu libera ret vacuo meditabar vivere lecto, at me composita pace fefellit amor could have shown the continuity of this composita pax, or the hilaritas, but we could find it as well in several stanzas of Gray, but we hadn't but one, now rather part of the text than of the performance. In Rilke's tentative to escape the normal horror of World War I, in the Duino elegies, the in-between state has become a formal feature, a cutting-up routine that might have inspired Celan after World War II, or Burroughs, from whom I borrowed the expression cutting-up routine. Cutting is not restricted to elegy, but it serves as a tool to achieve the same search for coolness in elegy that we have found in ancient elegies. Thank you.
I'm sure there are questions, remarks.
I'm not sure.
It was so interesting. If not, maybe Liva will say something about
time.
Yeah.
About time. Yeah.
It's time for
about
a
time.
coffee break. It's planned for 20 minutes, but maybe we can go for 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just to say 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you for.